The Ontario government finally revealed today why one of its senior cabinet ministers abruptly resigned last week. Initially, Premier Doug Ford's office said Jim Wilson stepped down to get treatment for addiction. Today, Ford confirmed additional reports that Wilson is also facing allegations of sexual misconduct. The Premier says he didn't make this public immediately in order to protect the complainant.
The addiction issue is a real issue. Mr. Wilson has gone to rehab. Following that, immediately after, they said there's been allegations. And the person that came forward with the allegations asked to be protected. And I'm gonna protect that person, no matter who it is.
The federal Conservative Party is also dealing with its own case of misconduct. MP Tony Clement was removed from caucus today over a sexting scandal. Could these incidents impair the party's reputations? Jamie Watt is executive chairman with Navigator and has worked with both Tony Clement and Jim Wilson in the past, and he joins me now. Hi, Mr. Watt. Great to see you.
Hey, how are you?
Thanks for coming in. I appreciate it. I'll start with Mr. Clement. Do you think he can politically survive this?
You know, one thing is, obviously he made a mistake. He's acknowledged that mistake. Mr. Scheer has acknowledged that he made a mistake. He's out of the caucus. He's paid a pretty big price for that mistake already. But Canadians do appreciate a second act. They do appreciate giving people a second chance. And I think whether he can come back or not depends not on what's happened to today, but what happens going forward.
And do you mean by that, I mean, the thing we were all sort of talking about last night was, okay, he's come clean, he said exactly what happened, but then as Mr. Scheer pointed out, seems to be new information coming forward, at least in the form of allegations. If there are more of those, does that obviously change the possibilities going forward?
Yeah, I think I would share your point of view. I think last night it looked like he came very, very clean. He was unequivocal in his statement in terms of taking responsibility, and I think people thought he did a very good job. I think what happened today is obviously worrisome, and that will determine, I think, whether he can, come back to the caucus and get reelected and come again.
What's happening? What would your guess be, or your perspective be on what's happening in the backrooms of the Conservative Party now, trying to figure out how to navigate this, and what went into deciding what they did in releasing that level of information last night?
These are really tough things for political parties because politics at the federal and provincial level, unlike the municipal level, is a team sport. And when one team member has some trouble or makes a mistake, they let the whole team down. And that's tough on the team because they like their teammate, they've been through the battles with them, they're fond of them, and then they have to come to grips with the fact that someone's made a mistake that's impacted all of them. So I think what the Conservatives are doing today is what any political party would do, which is taking stock of what that means and taking stock of how they pull the rest of their team forward and deal with it. It's really tough to do. This is something that happened to a friend of theirs, not to one of their opponents, and that makes it very different.
And what about Tony Clement as a person? I mean, tell me a bit about what you know about him. I mean, he is a well-known Conservative, not just provincially in Ontario, but right across the country.
I think that's one of the reasons that these things are so challenging and so difficult. We all make mistakes in our lives, and we all pay a price for those mistakes. The difference is politicians have those mistakes played out on newscasts, political programs like this, the front page of the paper, and they have to deal with those issues with themselves and their families and their friends under that glare, and that's a really tough thing to do. So I've been thinking about Tony and his family today as they deal with this news.
Do you think that this hurts the Conservative Party's reputation in any way, or is it too early to tell? How might it impact the party more largely?
Yeah, generally speaking, when these things happen, people are pretty understanding that people make mistakes, institutions or parties don't. I think if there were 10 people in the Conservative caucus all accused of the same thing, that would be different. But people are pretty fair about it. They realize a caucus is a big group of people, all kinds of different backgrounds, all kinds of different experiences. And when one of those people makes a mistake, I don't think it attaches to everybody. I mean, if we just rewind back to Ontario, when Mr. Brown left office last year, that didn't prevent the party itself from being elected to power. Mm-hmm. So people saw that Mr. Brown may have made a mistake, but that was contained with him. It didn't extend to the party as a whole.
How important is it to provide the level of detail that was provided? I mean, it was a bit odd to read. The first sentence, I think, of the statement was, "I sent sexually explicit photos and a video." Tell me about why that would have to be the case.
Well, today, people expect transparency and candor from their politicians and from their leaders. So I think most people would say that if you do make a mistake, the best thing you can do is own up to it and not to prevaricate, not to say, apologize in a wishy-washy way, not to apologize in a conditional way, but to own the mistake that you made, apologize for it, atone for it, and move forward. That is your best chance. The problem, of course, is when more information comes out, that clouds the water. And you can see the issue that Mr. Ford, Premier Ford, had to deal with when he's trying to balance a number of different competing interests. The public's demand and right to know about the behavior of their leaders, and at the same time, the request of the complainant to be protected. I mean, if that happened in business, if that was made against a chief executive officer or a leader in a business, that complainant would be protected too. That's part of what we would call best practices in dealing with these things.
How difficult it is in the case of Premier Ford then to figure, I mean, you say that he has to balance. There is some discrepancy though. I mean, Lisa MacLeod said earlier this week, yes, there's a third-party investigation, and the Premier wouldn't confirm that for a number of days. Does there need to be sort of an explicit way of dealing, being transparent to a certain degree, while also protecting the identity, of course, of the complainant?
I think what you saw was the fact that in one way the Ford government acted true to its values and convictions, and on the other way it acted as a new government. It acted very swiftly because it is a decisive government, and that's the way that they're conducting business. So they did move quickly. They didn't let any time go by before they acted. But it might have been a little bit lumpy along the way, and that's probably more reflective of them being a new government than anything else.
And what about Mr. Wilson? I mean, the idea, I think it sits a little odd with people as well that the reason given was that you're getting addictions treatment, which I understand he still is and is a very serious problem, and nothing should be taken away from that, and especially for all the other people who seek that kind of treatment as well. But to find out later then that it is also layered with allegations of sexual impropriety, and that was even the fact that there was something more to it was never revealed.
Right, and I think that's, again, is something that's very challenging for people, because when they saw there was a clue there, wasn't there, when it was announced that he went into rehab, but he was also kicked out of the caucus. And I think most people would say, I smell a rat here, right? If all he was doing was going to rehab, removal from cabinet would be probably the right remedy, but why is it that he's now sitting as an independent? So that was a little bit probably lumpy along the way, but I think they got to the right place in the end.
How difficult do you think it will be for political parties moving forward to rise up or meet the public's level of interest in extreme transparency and wanting to know everything? I mean, there are people on social media always saying, we want to know what happened. They have a direct line now to politicians. You don't need the filter of the media anymore. How difficult is it for political parties to rise to that challenge?
Well, I think what's going to be very hard is for candidates to rise to that challenge, because how many people have actually lived a life that will actually survive that kind of scrutiny? And then the other question you might ask yourself is, do we really want those people to be our leaders? They may be so different from the rest of us who have made mistakes and had problems in our lives that they don't do a very good job of representing us. So I think one of the questions going to become is, as people know more about our leaders, and as more of these things are exposed, will the importance of that in determining support or lack of that change?
Right.
It may be that the more we know about these things, the less they'll actually matter, and they won't be as salacious as they've been in the past.
We'll see. Thank you so much, Mr. Watt. Really
Pleasure.
Appreciate your insight. Thank you.
Tony Clement, at my request, has resigned from caucus. There were, I took him at his word that this was an isolated incident. Since then, there have been numerous reports of other incidents, allegations. So in that respect, I've asked Tony to resign from caucus so that he can respond to these allegations.
Conservative leader Andrew Scheer has removed longtime Tory MP Tony Clement from caucus. This happened only hours after Scheer said he was taking Clement's word that the explicit pictures and video Clement sent represented an isolated incident. Seems that perhaps, according to Scheer, may not be the case. Is the incident being handled properly? What are the implications of an MP being compromised this way? And is this the end of Clement's political career? It's time for the Power Panel. In Toronto, Amanda Alvaro of Pomp and Circumstance. Here with me in studio, Summa Strategies' Tim Powers and Kathleen Monk of Earnscliffe Strategy Group, and Chris Hall, host of CBC Radio's The House. Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Nice to see you. Tim, I will start with you. How do you think the party handled it today, and what do you make of what's happened?
Well, I think as Jamie was saying to you more about Ontario, there were some lumps along the way, but I think Mr. Scheer did the best he could with the information that he had. He took Mr. Clement at his word last night that there was an isolated incident. That incident, as Mr. Clement described it, was around a consensual, what he thought was a consensual relationship, though inappropriate given that he is married and has a family. Then more information started to emerge that suggested this wasn't a one-off, that there were other people who were unwantingly approached and felt uncomfortable at a minimum.
Or at least allegations.
Allegations of that appeared on Twitter. So I think Mr. Scheer did the right thing today as more information became available. There isn't, I think as we're learning in these stories, more comes after. That seems to be the pattern. So you can only act with what you have at the moment. There is a requirement to be fair both to the complainant, although there didn't appear initially yesterday to be a complainant. Mr. Clement was positioning himself as a complainant while admitting his wrongdoings. Today, there appeared to be others who were complaining in their allegations. So you have to respond to that. You have to be fair as best you can, but you have to move quickly. So I think he did the best he could, Mr. Scheer, in these circumstances.
Amanda, what do you think?
Well, it was, I was talking to a lot of people today about this story because obviously it was dominating and everybody was talking about it. And, one of the things that we were discussing was this idea that we're about to head into an election. We're about to elect new candidates. We're about to vet new nominees. And across the board for all parties, what's becoming, really apparent is how important these kind of like buried, hidden stories become. Maybe more important than ever before. And, obviously there's a tremendous amount of bad judgment that's involved in this particular story, but even judgment that's less terrible but still on this scale may dominate the next election in terms of the kind of lifestyle stories that we're telling about people. And I think it's changing the way we look at politics. Me Too movement was one thing, but how we're looking at the kind of behaviors that end up following you around, haunting you as you consider these positions of power, and how those stories are being unearthed and how they're being told. So we were really debating this idea of whether or not, amidst all of the policies that we'll be discussing over the next year, how many of these stories will percolate to the top. And while the federal Conservative Party is dealing with this battle right now, and at the provincial level, Doug Ford's government is also dealing with it. No party is inoculated against something like this.
Well, there are a couple of things to do. First of all, I only know what Tony Clement has actually said in his own statement, which is about the incident itself. It's great with hindsight to say maybe the first thing you should have done is just removed him from caucus until all of the other facts were out, because we do know that there was around a week, right, that people had been informed, the Privy Council office, which is the Prime Minister's secretariat, basically, maybe the PMO itself, and then finally Andrew Scheer, the leader of the Conservative Party. I think that would have sent up enough signals here that maybe we should just get him to step back and figure out what's going on. But that's the benefit of hindsight. To Amanda's point, I think is the really big thing here is that how do you police this kind of behavior? How do you ensure that people understand that when you put something on social media, it's with you forever? There is nothing that you can do to get rid of it.
Well, you just say that.
Well, you shouldn't.
Well, there's that.
But, I keep wondering, why do you have to say that to people?
Exactly.
Even my kids get this. So in any event, I feel badly for the people who are affected, which is Tony Clement's family. On the other hand, this is a cautionary tale, and I'm sure right now everyone in caucus is being told, think about anything you may have done, take a look. And not just this caucus, I would say every caucus saying, we got to go back. We're going into an election year here. We need to know that everything you've done that is going to be completely above board. It's not going to come back to haunt you later on.
Okay, but we can't only look at past action. So first, your question, how did Andrew Scheer, as leader of the Conservatives, deal with it? I'm not going to fault him. It took 12 to 16 hours for him to kind of the fulsome of the information to come out, and he acted and did the appropriate thing, I think, and ejected him from caucus. I was surprised it wasn't done last night. I was working late late last night, so I was at my computer watching the midterms, watching the stuff breaking with Vashi breaking the news, and I was sure he was going to be at a caucus last night. So I was surprised that it took this morning, but really that timeline is not long enough to throw any criticism their way. What I would say is that we can't just look at kind of historical instances that I think Amanda's referring to in terms of vetting candidates and what's coming up in social media right now. I think that there's a responsibility for politicians and some of us as political communicators who deal with crisis communications. When you are dealing with a crisis like this, you have to take action right away to protect the party, protect the leader. That's what we do in politics. And I think that what Chris pointed out about the fact that the information was known internally for a certain amount of time, that I'm surprised that Tony Clement, such a seasoned politician like him, decades in politics, wouldn't have immediately, exited caucus, protected the leader, protected the brand, and just removed himself, fallen on his sword.
That's an interesting point.
So, in crisis communications, you have to do it well. There's certain steps that you have to take right away. We know that. We do that in our firms. And I would have recommended, if asked, that he obviously made that action immediately.
But I also think...
Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, Amanda.
I also think, to your point, Kathleen, I think that there's just such a tremendous amount of ego that's involved in something like this.
And
where
hurt,
you feel
right?
like, and you feel like you can put, is it invincibility? Like, do you feel like you can put anything out there and it won't come back at you? And you must feel that way in order to do it, especially in this climate. There is nobody who's not, waking up, if you're a politician or a political staffer, and the first thing you're doing is looking at your phone and checking out what's on your Twitter feed. So you know how, excessively available these stories are. So you must have the kind of ego that would prevent you from doing the right thing. It's the same ego that made you do what you did in the first place.
Tim?
Again, we don't know the dynamics of what led to Mr. Clement not resigning, perhaps earlier, as Kathleen suggested. Perhaps we're seeing there were family dynamics at play. If Mr. Clement was engaging in this behavior, as he's admitted, do we even know that his family was aware at the time and he may have taken political actions before he took personal actions? There are lots of victims here. The other thing, though, I think should be patently obvious to all of us that, yes, there is the Anthony Weiner story. There are lots of these stories about don't do stupid things with technology. But what have we known since time immemorial? Humans are stupid. We make bad choices. Technology and the ability for us to self-immolate on a daily basis hasn't stopped that. It's not going to stop that. And Amanda makes the best point of all. Sometimes when you're in circumstances where you're doing things, you do think there's a degree of invincibility. It won't happen to me. It couldn't possibly happen to me. And it's that ego, it's that hubris, it's that sense that, no, I'll never get caught. And guess what? You get caught, and it's an awful thing. The penalty of him being thrown out of the caucus, I'm sure, is the least pain that Tony Clement is feeling
for
today.
sure.
One last thing on this. This news cycle will continue because there is clearly an allegation being investigated by police of extortion
that's
of this too, which adds to the complexity of the issue. Another reason that I think that, again, with the benefit of hindsight, that maybe either Tony Clement or whoever is around Andrew Scheer should have said, you need to step aside from the caucus for the time being. We'll see how that plays out, but that too is an old story. How many times have predominantly male politicians been caught up in these situations where their reputations and the potential for them to be blackmailed or to be extorted exist? It's not new. It's as old as politics.
Okay, I want to switch to the other sort of similar controversy brewing in Ontario, and that is Jim Wilson, a minister who served under Premier Doug Ford. He left caucus and his position as minister on Friday, I believe it was, saying that he was seeking addiction treatment, but then there were allegations that surfaced of sexual impropriety. The Premier finally addressed them today. Here's a clip, and I'll get everyone's reaction.
The addiction issue is a real issue. Mr. Wilson has gone to rehab. Following that, immediately after, they said there's been allegations. And the person that came forward with the allegations asked to be protected. And I'm gonna protect that person, no matter who it is.
And Amanda, I think the Premier had said at one point that the complainant didn't want this to turn into a media story. So how do you interpret, I guess, how this was handled?
I think it's really hard to weigh this story because on one side, of course, I think one of the victims become further victims as stories like this become very public, and especially the nature of what we've just talked about, how it's consumed in so many ways by so many people. At the same time, for the Ford government, there's this sense that something was hidden or buried. They tried to get around the story. And so I think that they're also dealing with what will be the backlash of that. But I do think that there's a bit of a balancing act to play, because we've seen it time and time again where somebody comes forward with an allegation and then that victim is re-traumatized by having to live through it in the public eye.
Kathleen?
Yeah, I agree with Amanda that it's really important that we protect the survivors and the victims in these stories, but I don't think that the Ford government had to handle it the way they did. I think they could have come out in a much clearer and more direct way, still protect the individual involved, and been more straightforward with the audience.
My understanding from people who are somewhat familiar with the situation is they would agree that it was clumsy or lumpy, to use Jamie's term, but given the people that were involved, that had made the allegations and the time and such the allegations had been made, it was important for a little bit of time to pass before the story was brought to the fore so that the complainant could be protected. I can't really say more than that, but...
Interesting.
I don't disagree with anything that I've heard. I guess when you're in Premier Ford's position, you're looking to try to maximize the potential to protect the person who doesn't want to be identified versus trying to make sure the public has some understanding of why a cabinet minister has suddenly resigned, and given how he'd been out with Doug Ford, I think just a day before.
Yeah, exactly. That day on the Friday.
Made it all the more awkward that people were going to start asking questions. So in whatever planning that was done, they had to weigh those two factors. They made a choice. I can't dispute the choice or disagree with it. That was a choice they made. In the end, so far that person's reputation and privacy is being protected, and Minister Wilson's getting the help he needs.